Well, welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to this co-sponsored webinar. Syrenis and Myna Partners have gotten together, and we've got a great program put together for you today that we're calling the ROI of Consent, Unlock 40% More Revenue with Personalization. And so we've got some fantastic content, and we're really glad that you've taken a little time to join us either for the live event if you're watching this live, or the recording if you're watching it as a recording. If you are watching this live, I wanted to let you know that we are encouraging of questions. So please post your questions in the Q&A panel, and we'll be monitoring those throughout the program. And we'll either take them in line, or more likely, we've designated some time at the end of the program to be able to answer those. Also, for those of you wondering, if you registered for the program, you're going to get a copy of the slide deck along with a recording, and it will be available on demand to watch or rewatch, as it were, following the broadcast. So that will come to you automatically if you've registered for the program. So with that, and without any further delay, let's go over and let me tell you a little bit about the structure of the program. In just a minute, I'm going to talk about who the decision makers are in the space and kind of what the state of play in the field is, kind of talk a little bit about that so people can kind of level set where they're at. And then we're going to go and talk about uh, privacy and consent management in general, get into some of the technical details. We're going to talk about how basically personalization can increase revenue. And we're going to get into some of the practical details of that, both through some statistics and then also through some real world client stories, both on the Syrenis side and on the Myna Partners side. So with that, let me go ahead and introduce today's panelists. And I'll start with myself. Again, my name is Dave Cohen. I'm a director here at Myna Partners. Been with the firm for about 4 years. Been in the privacy space for about 17 years now. And Myna Partners provides operational privacy services for companies largely in North America, but global companies that operate throughout the world. And we help make privacy happen for companies. So that's kind of what we do. Very pleased to be joined today by my friend and colleague, Luke Lubensky, who's Principal Solutions Engineer at Myna. So Luke, want to tell the folks a little bit about your post and a little bit about your background?
Thanks, Dave. Nice to meet you all. My name is Luke Lubensky. I'm the Principal Solutions Engineer here at Myna Partners. Been in the industry for about 6 years now, coming up with Myna just a little over the past 4. I run all of our technical implementations and design engagements with our clients, everything from ground up consent architectures and builds to customizing the finer details and tweaking the user experiences of the consent journeys themselves. So very excited to spend some time with you all here this morning, and looking forward to chatting with the rest of y'all.
All right. Thanks, Luke. And joining Luke on the panel, Neil Patel is a solutions consultant at Syrenis. Neil, can you tell us a little bit about what that role involves and maybe a little bit about your background as well?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dave. Hi, everybody. I'm Neil Patel, a solution consultant at Syrenis. I've been with Syrenis for around 3.5 years and in the industry for about 6. And my role consists of demoing the Syrenis platform and helping organizations really leverage our feature offerings in ways that balance compliance, customer trust, and more importantly, as part of this webinar, personalization.
Terrific. Thanks, Neil. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with the conversation. And I'd like to start us off by talking about who are the people that are involved in this conversation on the client or the customer end, largely. Some of the folks we deal with at Myna and some of the folks that are primarily involved over at Syrenis as well. And they really fall into 3 categories here. So compliance and legal is probably the most prevalent primary point of contact that we have over at Myna. And these are the folks that are within the organization, and they're looking at balancing risks so the business moves forward and continues to be successful and profitable with compliance requirements depending on what jurisdictions they're in. So a lot of times these folks are come in with a legal background and are charged with compliance and kind of overseeing that for the company. So they're one of the primary groups of people that we deal with over at Myna, and I'm sure at Syrenis as well. And then in the middle here, this is probably at the heart of what we're talking about on the webinar here today, the marketing folks. And why is that? Because in any organization today, of course, the digital presence is a large part of what's going on in terms of offering products and services. And the technological tools have just experienced just an explosion over the last years in our ability to deliver personalized messages to folks. So they're basically getting to see what they want to see that are relevant to them and not see the things that are not relevant to them. So with these incredibly sophisticated technological tools, the marketing folks have at their disposal. They are also trying to balance that being successful with the business, pushing the business forward, increasing revenue and profitability, while also staying within compliance. So we work with a lot of the marketing folks as well. And of course, none of this would be possible without the folks in IT and data. Absolutely critical to all of this, because that's essentially the platform, the infrastructure, the systems, the software solutions, and the security, the access controls, the IT and data people are absolutely critical to this conversation. So really, in a lot of the work we do, we have key stakeholders from all of these categories that are decision makers that we're working with, both on the Myna side and at the Syrenis side as well in terms of CMP. So moving on, let me tell you a little bit about kind of the state of play of the field right now. These are some statistics, as you can see, by Gartner, and as you can see in the far left there, 60%, 60 to 70% of large enterprises have adopted preference or consent management solutions at this point. I actually feel like that number is rather low. I think it's probably higher than that. Really, if you're going to be offering products or services today, you have a great website, you have the ability to offer e-commerce, and consent and preference management is really critical. So I think CMPs are widely adopted, and they're still being adopted, and some companies are still coming into the space, but clearly they're here and they're here to stay, and they're developing, and they offer fantastic efficiencies for the business. And the other thing I kind of wanted to touch on quickly here is that, I'm based on the East Coast of the United States, and here in the United States, there's no overarching federal privacy law governing the stewardship of personal information. So instead, there is a patchwork of U.S. state privacy laws. And there are a lot of similarities between those state privacy laws, but there are also some unique differences. So really, here in the United States, that's driving a lot of the compliance. So for a company to be buttoned up with in terms of its personal information management practices, paying attention to that patchwork of state laws is really key. And they do continue to increase. I think there's nearing 30 state privacy laws here in the United States at the moment, and probably more to come. And then, lastly, I really want to talk about some of the key sectors that are involved in management of personal information. And these tend to be retail, finance, and healthcare in general, some of the largest private sectors that just process a lot of personal information, and therefore are perfect candidates for looking to really maximize and optimize their consent and preference management amongst their customer base. So that's just hopefully giving you a good overview of the people that are involved and the kind of forces that are at play out in the field. And with that, I want to turn it over to Luke to talk a little bit about how privacy and personal choices have evolved in the online digital ecosystem. And Luke's got some great stuff to share with us about that. So Luke, over to you.
Thanks, Dave. We're going to spend the majority of the time today going through some very specific consent-related items, but to set the stage as to why, I want to talk a little bit about this cultural explosion of privacy in the first place. And oddly enough, their roots going back as far as 1905 with an expose piece by investigative journalist Upton Sinclair titled "The Jungle." I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here, but it's important to understand that there is this long history of American corporate risk and liability and the catch-up back that has to occur in order for legislation to match innovation and design. Brief history lesson. In The Jungle, Sinclair goes to great lengths to call out the abhorrent state of food manufacturing in the US during the turn of the 20th century, and the dangers to individuals, both employees and consumers, that are occurring in these conditions. We're talking about life-altering and physically threatening things like sickness and death that go unchecked as more and more aspects of life become streamlined and industrialized. It's a black box to consumers a lot of the time, unsure of what's actually happening in these corporations and the factories with their processes and how that food that winds up in their homes and on their dinner tables is actually being made. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries that Sinclair writes of, there wasn't the stringent legislation and testing of health effects that there is provided by government agencies like the FDA now. In fact, the FDA was started a year after Sinclair published this piece in 1906, and through his work here in The Jungle, Sinclair urged forward a huge boom of societal concern about a lack of corporate accountability with this aim of protecting consumers. And granted, privacy isn't as viscerally appalling as rats and fingers in your food, but this historic example is equally as important to understanding this spark of widespread privacy changes in both the public opinion and legislation that we're being seen driven so hard today. And this should all sound relatively familiar, eerily familiar too, with recent fines over failures to present people with what's actually happening behind the scenes related to consent options, black boxes of processing personal information, and data breaches over people's home information popping up in the news nearly every week. What we're seeing is this expedited growth of public concern about privacy now that it's more well known than ever. Now, privacy regulation, though, has been around for quite some time in our relative lives. It was here before the GDPR with the e-privacy directives, and it was here before the CPRA with the GDPR. But I think the most interesting aspect of privacy is that it's a new initiative for people, like human beings. Not referring to compliance regulations pre-GDPR, pre-CPRA, but rather privacy isn't something inherent to human beings, at least not in the form that it is now. The advent of privacy came about because of crossing boundaries that had never happened before. The etymology of the word private itself comes from the Latin privatus, what's set apart from the public. This crazy idea that a citizen was owed an expectation in difference of treatment for personal space versus being in their home or out on the town center. And on top of that, this is also where we get some fascinating crossover to reputational risk laws. The Roman calumnia, a focus of protecting a person's inner self, their personal details, the matters of their private lives. But now, through the internet and our devices, always listening, always watching, always a part of our lives, we've invited them into our home. The establishment previously understood to be the safeguard of privatus, the house, the home, a place without the public's prying eyes, is now a thin border, if any. The internet doesn't have boundaries. It isn't stopped by drawn blinds and locked doors, and even unplugging your router isn't enough to fully disconnect with our phones always on around us. So this is all new. We haven't quite figured it out yet. We don't know what sort of impact this has on how people experience life, or what happens when we get it wrong and we breach that privacy as organizations. In fact, Gen Z from 1997 onward never knew about a world prior to the internet. They are, the first to ever experience this new life and are actively dealing with learning about privacy and the internet through news of our organizations, and the organizations much like your own, and the actions that are being taken, both good and bad. And if you stop to think about where we are today with a bit of a retrospective lens, the majority of what the public knows and thinks about privacy is an overwhelmingly negative statement. What started as a cookie has then morphed into legally dense consent terms and preferences, preference centers with nearly impossible opt-out regimens, and an overwhelming fear of continued data breaches with real tangible repercussions to individuals' lives based on what's impacted. So we have to ask ourselves, what do we do now? With the increase of legislation in order to protect people from these instances, much like the FDA following Sinclair's expose piece, and public knowledge about what's going on behind the scenes, people are taking back control of their information and demanding this resurrection of privacy. And as we stand now at the precipice of this movement, organizations have a choice to make, one that sets the tone of how your brand is viewed and internalized by a consumer. And the most important aspects are how you manage consent and preferences, how you treat a consumer's data even when they're not looking, and the care that you give them as such. The transparency you provide to people and the respectfulness in which you do so, these are topics that should be looked at as brand value enhancers, not as detriments to your marketing return rates. And as Neil will talk about soon, what we're seeing in the industry is that by changing your brand's sentiment on privacy and transparency, consumers are more willing to embrace being open and being themselves with you, leading to more return, more opt-in rates, and an overall better experience on both sides of the transaction. As much as we like to look at things simply from a compliance point of view, privacy isn't just about hitting legislative requirements anymore. It's gotten too big and it's too public. It's too well known. It's about protecting people and this amassed data set that we all hold as organizations. And because of that, the reputation and perspective of your organizations by the public hinges in large part on how you treat them, and important to the conversation today, what they see on your website, your preference centers, and in the news.
Thanks, Luke. It was great understanding the Roman roots of privacy and ownership. So yeah, let's expand on today's consent and preference landscape. And beyond cookies, there is a whole world of untapped revenue based on personalized user journeys, all activated by consent and preferences. I often see organizations treat consent and preference as a legal checkbox exercise, but we really need to move past this archaic way of thinking and actually look at what your consumers have opted into, how engaged have they remained, and more importantly, what experiences have they received as a result. For those brands who only treat consent and preference as a checkbox exercise, it's most likely that you're not providing a level of personalization to your consumer base. And McKinsey found out 71% of consumers expect a level of personalization. And out of those, 76% become frustrated when it's not received. Now, that nicely works into PwC's consumer churn rate, as 60% of them switch to different brands after a couple of bad experiences. So how are you supposed to win those leaving customers back? You can't send them a couple of promotional offers through emails because they probably won't receive it. The damage has already been done by not providing a level of personalization. And Campaign Monitor backs this assumption up, as 80% of marketing emails tend to go unopened. So there's a clear trend. If you are an organization that treats consent and preference as just a legal checkbox exercise, you are missing out on the opportunity to personalize your consumer journeys. And Deloitte found out 69% of your consumers will actually spend more money if personalization has helped them. Now, that's a huge amount of revenue just left on the table. So what happens if you leverage consent and preference data to enable personalization? Now, let's take a look at what the experts say. McKinsey reported a massive 40% more revenue is generated by brands that excel at personalization. Now, that's an incredible statistic. So let's break that down further. A better user experience directly correlates to more revenue. So the challenge that brands have is, how can you enable a better user experience? Well, at Syrenis, the first step that we advise is offering granular ranges of consent and preferences throughout the user's consent journey. Now, picture this. If you're able to capture granular preferences like the frequency a consumer wishes to be communicated with, and the type of content they want to read when receiving your newsletters, then you can act on that data captured and provide a level of personalization that makes the consumer feel valued. And offering granularity also provides more frequent opportunities for your organization to be transparent. So at Syrenis, we recommend all organizations to implement an easy access, transparent preference center. Now, this is a tool usually found within your My Account section on a web page or mobile app, and ultimately it's there for users to review and change their consents and preferences when needed. Now, these are a great way to allow your consumers to understand exactly what they have consented to, and it also gives your organization the opportunity to capture extra granular preferences, and that will in turn drive personalization. The idea is to be transparent, to build trust, and then watch your consumer lifetime value increase. And that's exactly what Forrester have reported. There's a 20% increase in customer lifetime value from transparent data practices. And customer acquisition is a costly exercise. So another great statistic around implementing a transparent and easy access preference center is seeing the reduction in unsubscribe rates. This is because consumers can access the center easily. And because they're greeted with granular options, they tend to opt out of campaigns that they're not interested in, as opposed to opting out of everything. So granularity when it comes to opt-ins and opt-outs, combined with a preference center, is a great way to provide personalization to known consumers. But how about those consumers that have yet identified themselves? Google's research shows organizations can see a 2.9 times revenue uplift when they properly leverage first-party data. Now, that's an incredible statistic, and it might sound bold, but it also highlights the value of building trust and collecting data in the right stages. I won't go into all of these statistics on the screen here. As Dave mentioned, we will share this slide deck at the end to all of the webinar attendees. But I have noticed that there are a couple of privacy folks that have signed up to the webinar today. So, hey, how are you doing? Just to not leave you guys out, I have a statistic from Forrester, and they've done some research that found out organizations can see an 80% reduction in fines when they focus on transparency, granularity, and clear opt-in and opt-out choices. Many organizations set aside significant funds in case of breaches or compliance issues, but strengthening consent practices can dramatically reduce that risk. And being transparent, offering granular options, and building direct, trusted relationships with your users, you're not only improving user experience, but you're also meaningfully lowering your experience to fines. Okay, well, fantastic. I'm sure you folks all on the call are excited to hear about some of our real world customer success stories. So let's start off with one of my favorites. And so the first customer success story we have is from a large betting organization that we've worked with. And like many organizations, they were collecting consent, but it wasn't granular and it wasn't always captured at the right moments. And that meant a big portion of their audience was technically unknown or unreachable, which directly limited their marketing performances. So at the Syrenis team, we helped them introduce granular opt-ins, letting customers choose exactly what they wanted to hear rather than forcing an all opt-in or opt-out decision. They also implemented a modern preference center, giving users full transparency and control. And this didn't just support compliance, but it actually improved engagement because customers felt more in control of their data rather than opting out of everything altogether. Now, the biggest shift came from capturing consent progressively throughout the customer's journey. Instead of asking for everything up front, they made small contextual requests at the right time. And that approach consistently outperforms the traditional sign-up forms that we know today. And it grew the amount of high-quality first-party data this customer was able to obtain. Now, with clear, rich, and more accurate consent data, their marketing reach expanded almost immediately. And the results was really impressive. They saw a 40% year-on-year revenue increase from their marketing campaigns. And that's purely from having relevant, personalized communications. And that's what happens when you treat compliance as not just a checkbox exercise, but a strategic asset. You know, the business grows, trust increases, and marketing becomes significantly more effective. Another great real-world case study that we have is with a large global toy retailer. They wanted to move beyond the generic marketing stack that they had and look to tailor product recommendations based on what customers actually care about. So by implementing granular preferences within their preference center, they were able to capture data such as the age range, price bracket, and specific product themes from the buyers and the families that shop on their website. Now, once those insights were captured, the impact on marketing was immediate. They could surface the right products at the right time, on their on-site recommendations became far more relevant. And they also analyzed these preferences at a country by country level, which meant that if a certain collection was trending over one region, they could shift marketing spend the very next day to match that demand. So the result was a significant uplift in performance. When they compared their campaigns before and after implementing granular preferences through Syrenis, they saw a 43% increase in marketing campaign success. And that's driven purely by better personalization and a clearer understanding of what their audience actually wanted. So it's a great example of how consent and preferences isn't just a legal checkbox exercise, but can also assist in the direct boost of sales and marketing. Fantastic. Well, I'll hand it over to Luke, as I'm sure Luke and the Myna team have some equally exceptional customer success stories.
Absolutely. And continuing on the idea of empowering your consumers and customers through some personalization choices that you can provide, by giving users some additional options and functionality, what you can do is really leverage a lot of opt-down, which can provide large efficiency gains internally to your business operations as well. An example of that was last year we worked with one of the major cruise lines to design and implement a self-service preference center for their customers. By doing so, we provided another avenue of choice, which ended up resulting in a near 25% decrease in DSAR requests for deletion and opt-out following that implementation. What was previously 1,000 additional DSAR requests every week, requiring large efforts by business analysts to correctly action on, was now being converted into these opt-down transactions. What we had found was that by providing users the ability to select more granular marketing choices on their own accord, that consumer was less drawn to frustration. And as such, that resulted in less kind of nuclear DSAR opt-out and deletion requests. When instead, what the user would actually like to do is just change the frequency or reduce the type of communications that are provided. In turn, this also empowers maintaining that relationship with consumers as opposed to losing them entirely from your ecosystem, allowing for additional opportunities in the future to maybe adjust some campaigns or approaches and be a little bit more transparent in the way that you market to these slightly more sensitive audiences who are perhaps a little more particular to matters such as these. Additionally, in an age where transparency, particularly in media and news, is more important now than ever, focusing on providing an experience to users that builds trust from those initial clicks onto a website can really lead to substantially more return as well. We recently worked, well, over the past couple of years, we've been working with one of the largest news networks to implement cookie and tracking consent technologies on their website and also manage the users' opt-outs of those. And through some iterations in design, the language, and the styling of those banners and preference centers, what we saw was that we actually increased retention rates, and the news organization had a 39% year-over-year traffic increase, with a record-setting 92 million visits in one day for this organization, all while providing this very upfront, clear consent approach, which, traditionally you assume that this is going to be associated with a massive loss of statistics and maybe a loss of some visitors due to frustrating pop-ups, but instead, by focusing heavily on that user experience in the user journey, that impact can be substantially minimized while still providing that trust and transparency that users are seeking, particularly from a news organization. Throwing a default banner on your website may help to meet some compliance requirements, but ultimately it's going to hinder that ability and the pathway to actually navigate and interact with your website. By just taking a little bit more time and effort to fully think through those design and experience choices, a privacy banner can feel more like an enhancement to your organization's brand and perspective instead of a drawback to this journey. And as we move into the questions segment now, the last comment that I want to leave y'all with: people are getting more educated about privacy online and more empowered to regain control of their data. What we're seeing across all of the industries that we work with is this adoption of privacy-focused technology and ideals at a pace that we previously hadn't seen before. And this isn't being driven just by the regulators or just by compliance requirements, but simply by the consumers and by the public asking for more and more and more of it. Between this public perception and the legislative growth in all regions, providing a transparent and trustworthy experience online is now more vital than ever.
Perfect. Well, thanks very much, Luke, and thank you, Neil, for those really insightful short presentations. And now is the time when we want to take your questions. So we have a couple questions here, and we're going to get to those in just a minute. But before we do, we have a quick poll, just 4 short questions to kind of get a sense of what's happening out there in the audience. And hopefully it'll be interesting for those of you that take the poll to be able to see the results of kind of what your peers are doing out there as well. So the first question is, do you have a consent and preference management system? Pretty straightforward, yes or no. Question number 2 is, if yes, who is your current provider? Number 3 is, are you considering purchasing a CMP or switching from your current provider? And so go ahead and at your leisure, go ahead and take that poll. We're going to open that up for you, and you'll be able to see the percentages of the results being displayed. And we'll give folks just a minute to go ahead and take that poll. And actually, there's one more question, which is, did the information presented in this webinar for valuable insight into the benefits of consent and preference management? So it's kind of curious about that. So if people will go ahead and take that poll, and then when you do, we will then display the results, and people can kind of see how others are voting there. So I'll just give you a minute there to go ahead and take the poll. All right, and so while people are doing that, I want to get to a couple of the questions that we've got here. And first of all, I wanted to say, just by kind of tying things together, it sounds like we've got basically a triple win here. Going back to the origins of your presentation, Luke, you were talking about how important it is in today's online world to build up that trusting relationship with customers and consumers. It's actually absolutely critical. That's how you grow your customer base. And then by the second win is by doing that, it sounds like, based on what Neil is showing us in terms of those statistics, you can very significantly increase your revenue and your sales by building up that trusting relationship. And while doing all of this and implementing a customer, a consumer and preference and choice management system, you're also going to be staying in compliance with the law and being able to avoid potential fines by the regulators, because we all know that there's been some very active enforcement actions out there in the regulatory space. So kind of building on that, Luke, I know that you and I were talking about the recent California Sling TV enforcement action, which has now been made public. That was a pretty significant fine. Can you tell us a little bit about what that was all about, and how what we were talking about today might help companies avoid fines like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Sling TV thing is actually quite interesting because it's the first time we've seen someone come back, specifically the Attorney General, come back with some very, very pointed insight. And they're almost looking at this and saying, we're going to make an example of Sling, and you all better follow suit. And so we've actually been working with quite a few streaming and TV platforms and networks in order to help nudge them along a little bit more towards that foundational piece that the Attorney General is looking for. So perhaps the most important part that the Attorney General noted in their comments for the Sling TV action, and again, this was a $500,000 fine, which is probably on the low end for what we're going to be seeing going forward, was a couple things. The first was, if you know who a user is, you shouldn't have to ask them more information in order to action on their requests. If they're authenticated, if they're logged into your services, you should be supplying them with the ability to opt out, perform deletion requests, perform access requests without funneling them to another web form, searching for additional data on top of it. The long story short is you can't make DSARs difficult to complete anymore. Right? At the end of the day, the way that these laws are written, well, granted, not written by technologists or people who specifically understand the rules of the internet or how things function, they're written with a general sentiment. And that spirit is to protect the consumers from bad business practices or intentionally malicious practices that are going on. So, in addition to some of these things like, hey, we need you to call someone in order to opt out because that's harder to do and people are less likely to pick up the phone, the Attorney General is also looking at smaller things to say, hey, if a user has signed up to your services through an online portal, they should be able to opt out or delete their account through an online portal while they're authenticated without providing more information. At the end of the day, what we are seeing a trend towards, and I think it's very fascinating because it's actually quite a bit different from where I would have assumed we were going with this legislation, is towards a more empathetic approach for consumers. The Attorney General and other regulators are looking at this and saying, we can't permit this anymore. This has gone on for too long and it's happening to an extreme and an extent that is just not representative of what we want in our marketplaces. And because of that, these actions like the Sling TV, I think, are just the start of continuing to push people towards removal of dark patterns, making things more explicitly easy and stated for people to perform actions on, and overall, making a better user experience for those consumers. Again, we talk about frustration or this lack of transparency and trust. While you might gain some short-term benefit because, hey, maybe you don't have to answer as many DSAR requests, what you're going to see in the long term is, people posting online, hey, I had a bad experience here. I had a bad experience there. This is impacting me. I'm not going to choose this brand anymore. And that's a sentiment that we're seeing reflected in both how you treat consumers from a kind of customer representative perspective regarding their data, and then also what they see in the news related to your organizations. I'm sure Sling's TV's marketing people are not too happy that they were called out by the Attorney General, and we certainly don't want to see any of our clients be next.
Yeah, that's true, Luke. And you mentioned the term dark patterns. I think a lot of the folks on the call may be familiar with the term, but just for those that aren't, to define that, this is something that's pretty high on the regulators' radar right now, and it's simply urging customers or your consumers, your customer base, toward one decision very strongly as opposed to another, instead of offering equal options and being respectful and transparent with, you can do it this way or you can do it this way. So in order to avoid that, engaging a consent management platform properly is the way to avoid having those dark patterns popping up, and thus avoiding potential attention from regulators. So very insightful. Really appreciate that, Luke. And now, Neil, over to you. We've got a question that came in. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, and that's it's a request to kind of talk a little bit about what you mean by granularity and how that can lead to hyper personalization. Can you kind of discuss that? It's what does that kind of look like?
Yeah, sure thing. So if we talk about hypergranularity, what that essentially is breaking down a consent and preference into very specific bite-sized options rather than having broad categories. So one that we typically use is newsletters. Usually within the industry, it's just a simple case of opt-in and opt-out. With hypergranularity, what we would do is break down the newsletter consent down into further preferences. It might be broken down into the topics that you are able to action on and send out as part of the newsletter subscription. It might be the language that you send out on the newsletter. Maybe it's the time of day or the frequency. And the idea is to provide a level of granularity at that level to your consumer base, so then they expect the communication on their terms, and that resonates with them further, driving high intent.
Terrific. Appreciate that. And then I think we really have one more question. And again, kind of, Neil, I want to talk to you about this. There's been a movement and a lot of talk over the last couple of years about having companies rely more significantly on first-party data, and that is defined as data that's collected directly from the organization, from their customers, and less so leaning on what's called third-party data, which is data that is typically collected and aggregated and provided by other companies, and then typically sold as lists, or access can be given to that data, third-party data. So there's been a movement kind of away from third-party data and leaning more heavily on first-party data. Can you talk a little bit about that trend and what you see going on there and why that may be beneficial?
Yeah, sure thing. So, I mean, before I answer the question, it's really important to understand why this trend has occurred. And it all started with Google stating that they will be deprecating their third-party cookie functionality. Since then, they've decided to take a step back from fully deprecating third-party cookies and instead shift the power onto their users. So now users could choose whether to allow third-party cookies or not when browsing through your websites. And that means organizations can't depend on them, and it's not a stable and consistent data source as it was before. And that's why there's this discussion between first-party data collection and third-party. And all first-party data is data that's collected directly from your users with clear consent. And because it's clear, because it's direct, the value is it's accurate, it's more dependable, and it's future-proof, unlike third-party data. And if we link that to a question that we had prior, which is hyper-personalization, if you're able to capture these first-party interactions with your consumer base, then you can definitely build anonymous user experiences before the user has made themselves known to you. So let's say you browse a website and a pop-up occurs asking for specific products that the user might be interested in. And if your user base selects a couple of options, that's data that you've collected firsthand. They might still be anonymous, but the power is you can take away those statistics as anonymous trend analysis. You can provide further pop-ups based on their previous answers to help steer them in the right direction. And more importantly, you can enable personalization based on the answers that they've given you.
That's terrific. That makes a lot of sense, Neil. So with that, we are just about out of time. I wanted to thank everybody very much for dedicating a little of your time with us. I hope you found this program useful, insightful, and even enjoyable. So we really appreciate it, both from the Syrenis team and the Myna Partners team. And as I mentioned at the top of the program, you will be receiving a follow-up email with the deck, PDF of the deck, and a link to the recording, a way to be able to view that online. And if you'd like to get in touch with us, just reply to that email and we can put you in touch with any of the three of us and for any further questions that you may have. So one last time, thanks everybody for joining us. We really appreciate your attention. Hope you enjoyed the program and we will see you on the next one. Have a great rest of your day.